Welcome to our deep dive into the market revolution.
Ah,
We're going to unpack this era of massive change in the U.S. between the Revolution and the Civil War,
yeah.
a time when America really started to boom. You shared an excerpt from the American Yawp with us,
Right.
and I think what's so interesting about this period is that it wasn't just about growth, but about the growing pains that came along with it.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a two steps forward, one step back
Yeah.
situation.
Yes, exactly. And those steps back were sometimes pretty dramatic. We'll be looking at those economic panics,
Oh, yeah.
basically depressions,
Okay.
that hit in 1819, 1837, and 1857.
Wow.
It makes you wonder, how did people at the time understand these crashes?
Right. Did they ever question the system itself? Or was it more about trying to find ways to predict and avoid these downturns?
Well, from the sources you've provided,
Okay.
it seems like the belief in the new system itself remained pretty strong.
Okay.
There was a lot of talk about speculation and risky investments,
Yeah.
especially around things like land and cotton.
Uh-huh.
When those bubbles burst, it caused widespread chaos.
So people were looking for someone to blame.
Right.
But the idea of the market economy, this engine of progress, wasn't really in question.
That's right. And to understand this unwavering faith and progress,
Okay.
we need to picture what life was like before this rapid change.
All right.
Think back to pre-revolution America. Most people were living on farms,
Yeah.
producing much of what they needed themselves. Travel was slow, trade was limited, and news traveled at the speed of horseback.
It's like a completely different world.
Yeah.
And then suddenly everything speeds up. Yeah. We get the Erie Canal, steamboats, railroads. It must have felt like stepping into the future.
It certainly did for many. The sources paint a vivid picture of this transformation.
Yeah.
Remember Margaret Dwight's journey to Ohio in 1810?
Oh, yeah.
It took her 6 weeks of grueling travel on almost impassable roads.
6 weeks. It's hard to even imagine that level of discomfort. It makes you appreciate our modern transportation system, even with all its delays and frustrations.
Absolutely. But think about this. Just 19 years after Dwight's arduous trip,
Yeah?
Francis Trollope travels the same route and describes the national road as a pleasant garden.
What?
That's how quickly things were changing.
Wow, talk about a stark contrast. So we have this explosion of connectivity, goods flowing faster and farther, cities growing at an incredible pace. But then those economic panics you mentioned earlier hit.
Right.
It seems like there was a real disconnect between the excitement of this booming economy and the very real hardships people faced.
And that disconnect becomes even more apparent when we look at the role of cotton in this whole story.
Ah, yes, Southern cotton, the engine of the American economy,
Right.
but also deeply intertwined with the horrific institution of slavery.
Yeah.
How does this white gold, as it was called,
Yeah.
connect to the North's factory boom?
It all comes down to supply and demand. Northern factories were producing textiles on a massive scale,
Okay.
and they needed raw materials to feed that production.
Enter Southern cotton.
And Eli Whitney's cotton gin really threw fuel on the fire, didn't it?
It did.
A seemingly simple invention that had massive and ultimately tragic consequences.
Exactly. The cotton gin made processing cotton much faster and more efficient,
Right.
leading to a surge in production.
Yeah.
But this efficiency came at a terrible human cost. It also led to a surge in the demand for enslaved labor to plant and harvest that cotton.
So while the North was moving away from slavery, their industries were still deeply entangled with the South's system.
Absolutely. Northern factories were buying Southern cotton.
Okay?
Northern banks were financing Southern plantations.
Yeah.
And Northern ships were transporting goods produced by enslaved people. There's a deep economic entanglement there, a shared complicity that's often overlooked.
It really highlights the complexity of this period, how economic progress was often achieved at the expense of human rights and social justice.
And that tension between progress and its costs becomes even more apparent when we shift our focus to the North and the rise of the factory system. So we're moving from small-scale craft production to these massive centralized factories.
Right.
It must have been a completely different world for workers.
It was a dramatic shift. Imagine working as a skilled artisan, producing goods from start to finish in your own workshop. Then suddenly you're one of hundreds of workers in a noisy, dangerous factory performing repetitive tasks for long hours.
It's almost hard to fathom that transition. Was there any resistance to this new way of working?
There certainly was, but the momentum of industrialization was powerful.
Yeah.
And one of the key figures in this shift was Samuel Slater, a British mill worker,
Mm.
who some might say stole the technology for these advanced textile machines
Oh.
and brought it to America.
Industrial espionage. It sounds like something out of a spy novel.
It does, doesn't it?
Did he really memorize the blueprints for these machines?
According to the accounts he did,
Right.
Slater was determined to recreate these British factories in America, and he succeeded. Places like Lowell, Massachusetts became model mill towns,
Mm.
showcasing the potential of this new industrial system.
Model. Mill towns, but for whom? I'm thinking about the mill girls mentioned in the sources.
Yeah.
Those young women working long hours in these factories. What were their lives really like?
Well, the term model might be a bit misleading. The sources paint a picture of harsh working conditions for these young women. Long hours, low pay, strict rules. They were essentially living under the thumb of the company, residing in company-owned housing, and subject to constant scrutiny.
It sounds more like a company town than a model town.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine having so little control over your own life, especially as a young woman in a society that was already pretty restrictive.
And yet, despite these limitations, these mill girls weren't passive victims. In fact, they were some of the earliest labor activists in America, organizing strikes and demanding better treatment.
That's inspiring. They saw these injustices and they decided to fight back. What were their demands? Were they successful?
They demanded shorter working hours, better wages, and improved living conditions. Their success was mixed, but their actions paved the way for future labor movements and challenged the idea that workers had to simply accept whatever conditions their employers imposed.
It's a reminder that even in the face of seemingly overwhelming power, people can find ways to resist and fight for their rights. And this was all happening as the corporation itself was emerging as a major force in American life, right?
Exactly. The corporation, this new legal entity with its own rights and powers, was both exciting and unsettling for many Americans.
Yeah.
It represented the potential for growth and innovation, but it also raised concerns about concentrated power and the erosion of individual liberty.
I can see how that would be a cause for concern. Even Thomas Jefferson, the champion of individual liberty, expressed anxieties about the potential tyranny of corporations.
He did. In fact, the American Yawp quotes him as fearing the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations. It makes you wonder if some of those anxieties are still relevant today, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It seems like we're still wrestling with the same questions about the role of corporations in society, the balance between economic growth and social responsibility. But before we jump ahead too far, let's talk about free labor, a concept that was central to this period.
Yes. Free labor is a fascinating and complex idea. On the surface, it sounds pretty straightforward. Workers are free to choose their employers, no longer bound by apprenticeships, or in the North, by slavery.
So it's about individual freedom and opportunity, the chance to work hard and get ahead. Sounds like the American dream in a nutshell.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it wasn't quite that simple in practice.
You're right. The reality of free labor often fell short of the ideal. While there were certainly opportunities for advancement, we also see a growing gap between the wealthy owners and the struggling workers.
So it's not just about being free to choose your employer, but also about having real choices, real opportunities to improve your lot in life. And did everyone have those opportunities?
That's a crucial question, and the sources suggest that access to those opportunities was far from equal. The growing disparity in wealth and income created a stark divide between the haves and the have-nots.
So the promise of free labor was in many ways limited by the realities of the economic system itself.
Mm.
What was the response to this growing inequality? Did people just accept it as the natural order of things?
Not everyone did. Workers began organizing, forming unions to fight for better wages, safer working conditions, and a greater share of the economic pie. We see the rise of carpenters' unions, shoemakers' unions, and other groups banding together to improve their collective bargaining power.
It sounds like this period was a real turning point in the history of labor relations in America.
Yeah.
What was the reaction of the elites to this growing labor movement?
There was a range of responses. Some, like Daniel Webster, argued that hard work and good character were the keys to success, suggesting that workers should focus on individual effort rather than collective action.
That sounds like a familiar argument, one we still hear today. The idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, the myth of the self-made man.
Exactly. But labor activists like Seth Luther saw it differently. Luther called out what he perceived as a cruel system of extraction, arguing that the wealth of the few was being built on the backs of the working class.
So we see this clash of ideologies emerging, these competing narratives about the nature of economic opportunity and social mobility. It's a debate that continues to this day. But it wasn't just the world of work that was undergoing a transformation during this period, right? Home life was also changing dramatically.
Absolutely. The market economy had a profound impact on family life, reshaping roles and expectations, particularly for women and children.
So we're seeing a shift from the traditional family farm where everyone worked together to a more specialized division of labor within the household. What did that look like?
Well, for many working-class families, especially those struggling to survive in urban centers, childhood was often cut short. Children were expected to contribute to the family income, working in factories or taking on other jobs.
That's heartbreaking. It's hard to imagine children being denied the opportunity to play and learn to simply be kids.
It was a harsh reality for many, and it stands in stark contrast to the experience of middle-class children who are more likely to be sheltered from the demands of the marketplace, with education seen as the key to their future success.
So we're seeing the emergence of a class-based distinction in how childhood has experienced a divide that continues to shape educational opportunities and life outcomes today.
And this period also sees the rise of the separate spheres ideology, the idea that men belong in the public world of work and politics, while women's domain is the private sphere of home and family.
It sounds like a very neat and tidy division, but I'm guessing it wasn't quite so simple in reality.
You're right. The sources are careful to point out that this separate spheres ideal was largely a middle-class aspiration. Many women, especially in poorer families, had to work outside the home to help their families survive.
So it's another example of how the ideal often clashed with the reality. And speaking of clashes, this era also witnessed a massive wave of immigration, mostly from Ireland and Germany. How did this influx of newcomers impact the social and economic landscape?
It had a profound impact. Millions of people were drawn to America by the promise of economic opportunity, fleeing famine, poverty, and political upheaval in their home countries.
It must have been a daunting journey, leaving everything behind, venturing into the unknown. What were their experiences like once they arrived?
It varied greatly depending on their background and skills. The Irish, who are often fleeing famine and poverty, tended to arrive with few resources and settled in urban areas, taking on low-wage jobs.
So they were often competing with native-born workers for those scarce jobs, which probably created tensions.
Exactly. And those tensions fueled a backlash against immigrants, particularly those who were Catholic. This backlash took the form of nativism, a movement that sought to restrict immigration and preserve American culture and jobs for native-born citizens.
So we're seeing a pattern here. Economic change leads to social anxieties, and those anxieties often get directed at newcomers, those perceived as outsiders.
It's a familiar story, isn't it? And those anxieties are often exploited by politicians and others seeking to divide and conquer.
And it's not just about economic competition, is it? There's also a cultural dimension to this backlash, a fear of difference of the other.
That's right. Nativists often portrayed immigrants as a threat to American values and traditions, using stereotypes and fear-mongering to stoke resentment and justify discrimination.
So even as America is being built by immigrants, we're seeing this deep-seated resistance to those who are different, those who don't fit the dominant cultural mold. It seems like a contradiction at the heart of the American experience.
It's a tension that runs throughout American history, a struggle to reconcile the ideals of equality and opportunity with the realities of prejudice and exclusion.
And this tension is particularly acute in the context of the market revolution, where economic growth is creating both immense wealth and stark inequalities.
Exactly. And by the 1850s, these inequalities, combined with the simmering tensions over slavery and states' rights, would culminate in the tumultuous events leading up to the Civil War.
It's almost as if the market revolution, with all its dynamism and innovation, also planted the seeds of its own undoing. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's step back for a moment and consider the lasting impact of this era.
What's fascinating about the market revolution is that its legacy is still very much alive today. The choices made during this period, the systems put in place, the ideas debated, they continue to shape our economic and social landscape in profound ways.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the market revolution, what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners? What's that one big idea they should hold on to?
I think it's this. The market revolution was a period of incredible innovation and progress.
Right.
But that progress came at a cost.
Yeah.
And that cost wasn't distributed evenly.
Some benefited more than others.
Right.
And some were left behind entirely.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that economic change always has social and political consequences.
Precisely. And it's up to each generation to grapple with those consequences and to strive for a more just and equitable society.
What aspects of this era resonate most strongly with you?
What I find most compelling is the agency of ordinary people. We see it in those early labor strikes, in the ways families adapted to changing roles, in the sheer resilience of immigrants facing unimaginable challenges.
That's a great point.
Right.
Amidst all the upheaval,
Right.
there's this incredible spirit of human determination, and that spirit probably resonates with you too, dear listener.
Yeah.
You know, if we connect this to the bigger picture,
Right.
what lessons can we learn from the market revolution that can help us navigate the complexities of our own time?
That's a good one to ponder.
It is. And I encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating period.
Yeah.
Maybe check out some of the recommended readings listed in the American Yawp.
Right.
There's a whole world of knowledge waiting to be discovered.
Happy reading.